Hello and welcome to my channel, where I'll be telling you all kinds of strange stories, ranging from true crime to some much less believable, although just as fascinating, tales. For today's video we have the scary story of Joanna Dennehy. Listen in and see what you think. The story of Joanna Dennehy and her killings begins on the 30th of March 2013. Or rather, this is where something was first discovered to be amiss. There is a lot that comes before this date, and we'll get to that as the story unfolds. On the 30th of March 2013, a man was walking his dog in an area known as the Fens in Cambridgeshire when he came across a body. The body was that of a man. He was lying in a ditch and naked below the waist. On his top half he was wearing a black sequined dress. When the body was examined, it was found that he had been viciously stabbed to death, and the killer then callously left his body in the middle of nowhere, the Fens being a quiet, agricultural part of the world. This was 48-year-old Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee, married and a father of two, worked as a landlord and had been missing from his home in Peterborough, not far from where he was found, since the 29th of March, when his burnt-out car had been discovered. It seemed to the police that whoever had murdered Kevin had left his body in the open, dressed in women's clothing, to humiliate him. It was all done on purpose. This was not a random attack. It was personal. It wasn't long before the finger of suspicion began pointing towards a 30-year-old woman named Joanna Dennehy. Phone records showed that Kevin and Joanna had spoken frequently in the days leading up to his death, and she was one of Kevin's tenants. Something else that didn't bode well was that she was known to be an associate of a man named Gary Stretch, so called because he was 7'3". Gary had been to prison for burglary and theft, and he knew the Fens area well, having lived there for some time. On top of this, Joanna's mobile phone data showed that she had been close to where Kevin's burnt-out car had been found on the day he went missing. She wasn't the only one. Gary Stretch had been there too. Could Joanna and Kevin had got into a dispute about rent or the property? Could Gary Stretch have come to his friend's aid, and that was why Kevin Lee had been murdered? This was certainly something the police were interested in finding out, but since Joanna and Gary were missing, this was proving more and more difficult to do. The police sent out notifications in the local area that they were suspects, they were considered extremely dangerous, and that no one should approach them. But just who was Joanna Dennehy? Why was she hanging around with criminals? Let's look at her past so that we can come back up to date. Joanna Dennehy was born in August 1982 in St Albans, Hertfordshire. She was raised in Harpenden by her parents Kevin, a security guard, and Kathleen, a supermarket worker, and they had hoped their daughter would become a lawyer. Her childhood was a happy, loving one, so it's perhaps all the more surprising that she would turn out to become a spree killer, because in the end, that is what she became. It all started going wrong when Joanna grew into her teenage years. She began spending time with the wrong crowd and seemed to enjoy the bad behaviour and notoriety that brought her. She stopped attending school and began drinking and taking drugs. Her parents desperately tried to help her, but Joanna didn't want that help, and instead she ran away with her boyfriend. She had 2 children with him, but the relationship, unsurprisingly, was a turbulent one. Joanna used to leave her boyfriend and children for long periods of time, simply disappearing without letting anyone know where she was going or when she would return. This is also when she began to self-harm and carry knives, very big knives, around with her. At this point, her boyfriend had had enough, and in 2009 he took the children and left. It seemed that this was the right call. Joanna's drug issues were not getting better, and she was constantly in and out of prison on drugs charges. She also spent some time in a psychiatric ward, where she was diagnosed with a variety of mental disorders, such as antisocial personality disorder and psychopathic personality disorder. This is where she met Gary Stretch, and once she left hospital, she rented a house from Kevin Lee. Kevin Lee's properties were, for the most part, rented out by people in similar situations to Joanna. They were troubled, perhaps ex-prisoners, and they needed a new start. This is actually what Kevin's intention was. He wanted to help people who might otherwise fall through the cracks. Not everyone appreciated what Kevin was trying to do, and that meant he sometimes had trouble with his tenants. Once Joanna moved in, this changed. Kevin could see that she was tough and wouldn't put up with any nonsense, and the pair got on well. So Kevin hired Joanna to be his rent collector. She certainly wasn't going to let people get away with not paying. This was a task Joanna took on with relish, kicking in doors and beating people up when they were even a day late with their rent payment. Kevin was so impressed with her work that the pair started a sexual relationship, and that led to Joanna living rent-free. Joanna used to tell Kevin all kinds of lies about how she had ended up. She told him that she had been abused as a child, and even that she had killed her own father, for which she had spent 13 years in prison. None of this was true, but Kevin believed her. Joanna was able to spin a good story, and she was extremely manipulative when it came to men. Now we come up to date, and Joanna Dennehy and Gary Stretch are on the run. They had left Peterborough and driven 3 hours to Hereford, where they had a friend who had put them up. When they arrived, they were in a fantastic mood, laughing and joking, and they took a series of funny, to them at least, photos to celebrate getting away with murder. When questioned, anyone who had contact with the pair at this point could easily tell that Joanna was the leader, and Gary was just following along, happy to do anything for her. Joanna's plan was to sell some stolen goods, and they arranged to meet up with a contact called Mark in Hereford. Joanna and Mark can be seen on CCTV going into a shop to buy some cigarettes, and at one point she hugs him from behind. This is not the sweet gesture it would look like to outsiders. She had a knife pressed to the man's chest. While all this was going on, police from Peterborough were racing to Hereford thanks to a tip-off from the local police. Joanna had gone to a petrol station and stolen a basket full of bits and pieces. CCTV showed this clearly. The police recognised Joanna, and the race was on. Sadly, some more terrible things happened before the police could reach Joanna Dennehy. As Joanna, Gary and Mark left the petrol station and were driving along, Joanna pulled out a knife, a very big knife. She turned to Gary and said, "You need to find me one." What did that mean? It meant that Joanna wanted Gary to find her another victim. She wanted to kill again. Dutiful Gary did as he was told. He spotted a man walking his dog on the pavement, slammed on the brakes, and Joanna leapt out of the car with her knife. She stabbed the man, this random stranger, over 20 times in broad daylight. Without a second thought, Joanna got back in the car, Gary started driving, and then she told him she wanted to do it again. So once again, Gary stopped the car as a man walking a dog came near. Joanna jumped out, stabbed the man multiple times, and after this, she even stole her victim's dog. Thankfully, it wasn't long after this that the police caught up with Joanna and arrested her. They found her waiting in the car, dog on her lap, while Gary Stretch went to buy a bottle of water. He was also arrested, and so was Mark. When she was arrested, Joanna didn't seem to be that bothered. She certainly didn't care about the 2 random people she'd just stabbed in 2 separate unprovoked attacks, although she was concerned about the dog. At the police station, Joanna can be seen flirting with police officers as she is being charged with her crimes.
Afternoon.
Joanna Christina Dennehy.
Joanna, you've been arrested before, Joanna.
Yes.
You've been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder and murder. Okay.
Why do we have to come to the station?
So dog will be he's in the kennel at the moment.
Exactly. I love your eyebrows. Thanks. Your very distinctive eyebrows.
I know. So you keep saying.
Active.
Arresting quite you.
You're decent cobber. Half got the whiskey this morning. Expensive stuff. I've had a really hectic week. Would you be cheering if you got up for attempted murder and murder? No, but I'm just smiling. This is amazing.
Looks good.
Thanks, Matt. That makes me so good. Real sexy. Attempted murder and murder, it's nothing. So going down for Sunday roast.
The day after Joanna was arrested and charged with murder and attempted murder, the lead detective on the case received a phone call asking if he was aware of the other bodies that had been linked to Joanna Dennehy. It would turn out that just 10 miles away from where Kevin Lee's body had been found on the 30th of March, the body of a 56-year-old Royal Navy veteran named John Chapman was also discovered. He had also been a tenant of Kevin Lee's and had been sharing the same house as Joanna Dennehy. The pair were known to dislike one another intensely. Neighbours told investigators that John was scared of Joanna, and it's hardly surprising given her personality and history. John had even gone as far as to tell friends that he was sure Joanna was going to kill him. And when police searched the house the pair shared, they found a blood-soaked mattress. But this was not the only body discovered close to where Kevin Lee had been found. There was another victim. This was a 31-year-old Polish man named Łukasz Szlaborewski. He had last been seen on the 19th of March 2013 withdrawing money from a cash machine. After this, he met up with Joanna Dennehy. It is suggested that they were in a relationship, although with Joanna this is always difficult to know for sure. After Łukasz was dead, Joanna kept his body in a wheelie bin at her home for a short while before having Gary Stretch come over to help her dump the body. How do we know this? Joanna took photos of Łukasz inside the bin, which she was more than happy to show anyone who took an interest, and plenty who did not. Both men, John Chapman and Łukasz Szlaborewski, had been stabbed to death. Łukasz was Joanna's first victim, and she would later tell police that once she'd killed him, she wanted to do it again and again, which is exactly what she did. By the time she was arrested, Joanna Dennehy had killed 3 men and attempted to kill 2 more. Luckily, the 2 men she stabbed randomly on the street while walking their dogs would both survive their ordeal.
And I suddenly felt what I thought was a really heavy punch in the small of my back. And then I turned round. I thought it was probably one of my mates or neighbours messing about, you know. And when I turned round, I saw this woman, and she just kept stabbing me in the chest. And then I fell backwards onto a grass verge, which is just by the cycle path.
And what did Joanna Dennehy do then?
She carried on stabbing me.
What did you say to her? What did she say to you?
She said something to the effect of, my boyfriend told me to do this. And she also said, oh look, you're bleeding, I'd better do some more. And I think I said, just leave me alone, please. Please leave me alone. But she didn't, she just carried on.
There was no real motive for the killings, other than the fact that Joanna simply wanted to try it, and once she had, she found she loved it. Yet despite that, she became rather shy when interviewed.
Did you murder Łukasz Szlaborewski?
No comment.
Did you murder Kevin Lee?
No comment.
Did you murder John Chapman?
No comment.
Not that it mattered. She was guilty. Joanna Dennehy was charged with 3 murders and 2 attempted murders. While in prison while awaiting trial, Joanna's diary was found. She had written out an escape plan in gruesome detail. The idea was to murder a female guard, steal her uniform and keys, and cut off one of the guard's fingers so she could get through the biometric locks. And Joanna was not alone in this. 2 other inmates were part of this plan. Knowing what they knew of Joanna, this was considered a credible threat by authorities. This meant she was placed in solitary confinement, which she went on to claim was a violation of her human rights. She took this problem of hers to the High Court, but, unsurprisingly, she lost the case. Before she could go to trial, Joanna Dennehy pled guilty to murder and attempted murder. In February 2014, Gary Stretch was given a life sentence with a minimum of 19 years. Mark was not found guilty of any offence. Joanna Dennehy was given a whole life term. When she heard this, Joanna Dennehy, who had just been told she would die in prison, a rare thing in the UK, with only 2 other women being handed this sentence before, and they were Rose West and Myra Hindley, said, "I want you all to know I am sorry for the attempted murders, but I am not sorry for the murders." And then she laughed.
Anything like this in my police career again. It's so unusual, but critically, she, in the way that she behaves and the apparent unemotional way that she goes about her terrible attacks, makes her absolutely the most dangerous person that I've ever met.
Thank you so much for watching my video. If you enjoyed this content, click the subscribe and the like buttons and you can receive more content like this strange story every week. See you next time.